Welcome to Honeybee, real stories of love, lies, and betrayal, where every truth stings. Let's begin. My name is Gerald. I don't think anyone walks into marriage thinking it'll crash and burn, but sometimes things fall apart quietly. When my wife stayed out all night against my wishes, against my concerns, what happened afterward wasn't what she saw coming. When Andrea and I first got married 5 years ago, everything felt like it had clicked into place. I used to look at her and think, this is the kind of love people write songs about. We were those love birds that people teased because we did everything together. Andrea back then wasn't just my wife. She was my best friend. When she spoke to me, there was some form of sincerity in her voice. We weren't perfect, but we were intentional. Looking back now, it's that version of us I struggle with the most because it was so good, so genuine, and that's what makes everything that happened afterward harder to swallow. We didn't start off broken. We chose each other, and for a while we chose right. But time, influence, and unchecked cracks have a way of eating away at even the strongest foundation. As time went on, I began to notice a gradual change in my wife's behavior. I didn't notice it all at once, but her circle of friends was the first thing I picked up on. I didn't pay much attention at first. I mean, we all have friends, right? But these weren't the same women she used to hang out with. These were new friends she met through work or social events, and something about them didn't sit right with me. They were all married, sure, but their attitudes toward marriage were off. They spoke about their husbands like they were burdens, clowns, or just plain stupid. I remember sitting in the room one evening while Andrea and a couple of them were having wine in the living room. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but I could hear everything. The way they laughed, mocking things their husbands said, making jokes about withholding affection to teach them lessons. It didn't sound like harmless venting. It sounded like disrespect disguised as girl talk. After a few of those evenings, I pulled Andrea aside and told her plainly, listen, I'm not trying to control who you hang out with, but the way they talk about their marriages isn't healthy. That stuff rubs off whether you realize it or not. I told her that marriage isn't a team if we're sitting in rooms where our partners are being ridiculed behind their backs. I was asking her to be careful, to be aware. She laughed like I just told her a joke. What? She said, you're scared I'm talking about you when they're around. I told her I was serious. I was saying it out of concern, but she brushed it off completely and turned the whole thing into a joke. I didn't push it any further. I let go because I didn't want to create tension. Over time, the views of my wife's friends started bleeding into our home. Andrea started picking on small things around the house. She'd say I made decisions without her, that I acted like my opinion was the only one that mattered. I was surprised because that had never been the case. I always saw us as partners. I reminded her that I wasn't dismissing her. I simply didn't agree with her on some things. But that's where things got harder. It wasn't just about having a voice. She wanted her voice to be the final one. Anytime I didn't go along with her opinion, she would get upset, and somehow I'd end up being painted as the controlling one. These arguments weren't just regular couple disagreements. They stretched for days. The house became a battlefield of silent tension. I'd suggest something logical, and she'd counter it with something emotional or unrealistic. And when I didn't budge, she'd double down as if I was trying to silence her instead of simply seeing things differently. It felt less like we were trying to build a life together and more like we were trying to prove who was in charge. I wasn't looking to control her, but the more I tried to explain that, the more she twisted it to mean I wanted her to submit to her. I was just trying to have my way and dress it up as teamwork. There were days I sat alone after an argument, just trying to figure out how we went from being each other safe space to walking on eggshells under the same roof. And every time I reached out to fix things, it felt like Andrea was pulling further away, convinced that I was a problem. One Saturday afternoon, I was home alone with Andrea. I'd just come out of the bedroom and was headed to the kitchen when I heard her voice in the living room. She was on the phone. I could tell right away it was one of her friends, one of those women I never really liked. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the moment I heard the word divorce, my feet froze. I stood just beyond the hallway, out of sight, and listened. Her friend was practically giddy. She was telling Andrea she had finally filed for divorce from her husband. But what really made my stomach turn wasn't the fact that she was getting divorced. It was how she was talking about it. There was no sadness, no grief, no talk about how things had gone wrong emotionally, just laughter and excitement over what she was about to get. I'm going after half of everything, she said proudly. I deserve it all after what I've been through. I didn't know the details of her marriage. Maybe she had her reasons, but hearing someone speak so casually about tearing apart a life with someone they once claimed to love, that shook me, and Andrea responded by laughing, agreeing, almost cheering her on. That's what really scared me. I stood there, thinking, is she entertaining the same idea? I didn't say anything to her about it, kept it to myself, but I started seeing our arguments through a new lens. Every time we fought, I'd wonder, is she building her case? Waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger, like her friend did. I didn't feel safe anymore. So I stopped discussing major financial decisions with her, stopped putting money into anything that could be easily split in court. I began quietly protecting what I'd worked for. It wasn't just paranoia. It was survival. When you start to feel like your partner could be looking at you more as a resource than a person, you moved differently. That call changed something. I never told her I heard it. I just started preparing for the possibility that someday she might try to walk away with more than just her suitcase. I couldn't afford to be foolish. So I made a decision to quietly consult a lawyer. I asked what could happen if Andrea decided to file for divorce. What could I lose? What I needed to know. It felt strange sitting in that office talking about worst case scenarios for a marriage. I still had Hope, Indiana, but I listened and learned. At that time, I was in the middle of planning a big purchase, a house. It was supposed to be for us. But after that consultation, I froze everything. I didn't put down a dime. The lawyer made it clear if we split and that house became marital property, it would get divided. Simple as that. And that wasn't all. I started separating my finances more carefully. I stopped moving money into our joint account. I moved investments into places that were safer. I stopped buying things that would automatically be considered ours. It wasn't because I stopped believing in marriage. In fact, it hurt to do it. Every decision I made in that direction felt like I was going against the promise I made on our wedding day. But the truth was, I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. Part of me still hoped Andrea would snap out of it, that she'd wake up and remember who we were before. All the noise and bitterness, that we'd get back to being a team. But the other part of me was preparing for the worst, because love without security is just wishful thinking. And I was tired of living in a house built on hope alone. One night, I had just gotten home from work. I walked into the house expecting at least some kind of normal evening. Instead, I found Andrea standing in front of the mirror in the bedroom, wearing a tight-fitted gown I had never seen before. She looked stunning. I won't lie. For a moment, I just stood there taking her in. But right behind that admiration was confusion and, honestly, concern. That dress was meant to turn heads. And I knew right away this night was going to be different. So I asked her gently, "Where are you going dressed like that?" She didn't even look at me at first, just applied one last layer of lip gloss and said, "It's none of your business." I stood there feeling a series of feelings I can't explain, but I didn't argue. I didn't want to feed into another endless fight. I think she probably noticed the silence and saw that I wasn't about to play her game this time. So she changed her tone to explain she was going to a birthday party. "It's just a girl's thing," she added. "Might last all night." Still, her body language said, "Don't bother me with your feelings." I told her I wasn't comfortable with her going out dressed the way she was, while I was being honest as a husband who felt like the foundation under his feet was starting to give way. She didn't want to hear it. She rolled her eyes and hissed. Then she turned back to the mirror, adjusted her hair, checked her makeup one last time, grabbed her purse and car keys and walked out the door. That night, after Andrea walked out the door dressed for her party, I sat in the living room for what felt like hours, frozen in place. The house was quiet, but my mind wasn't. It was racing. I kept replaying everything that had led us to this point. Every argument, every dismissive glance, every time I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. And as I sat there, something inside me finally gave out like a rope snapping. After being stretched too thin for too long, I didn't want to admit it, but I had been holding out hope for too long. Hope that the woman I married would come back to her senses. But the more time passed, the more she became someone I didn't recognize. The friends she kept weren't just bad influences. They were mirrors of what she was becoming. Her leaving the house that night was how far gone she already was, and how I had allowed myself to stay while being slowly pushed out. I stood up, walked slowly to the bedroom, and stared at our things. I opened the closet and pulled out just what I needed. Before I left, I sat at the dining table and pulled out a piece of paper and wrote, "I've tried to make this work, but I see now you've made your choice. I'm done trying. I'm leaving, and I won't be carrying the burden of your disrespect anymore. Good luck." I folded it, placed it where she'd see it, and left. I didn't know exactly where I was going. I found a nearby hotel and checked in for the night. While at the hotel, I was staring at my phone longer than I care to admit. Part of me still hoped she'd call, text, or even try to explain herself. A text, a missed call, even a half-hearted "where are you?" But nothing came. Not that night. By the second day, I knew if she couldn't find it in her to say anything. After walking into a half-empty house and seeing a goodbye letter on the table, then that told me everything I needed to know. I didn't want to drag things out, so I called a lawyer. If she were done, I would finish what she'd started. I wanted to be the one to take the first legal step. I told the lawyer everything, gave him the details, and within a week, she had divorce papers in her hand. Still no text, no call, no "Can we talk?" No, "Why are you doing this?" She didn't respond at all. Instead, she hired a lawyer of her own and dragged it to court. That move made things even clearer. She was interested in winning. or maybe just making sure I didn't. The court process lasted 7 months. Long. Enough for me to feel the weight of every decision. We split everything the way the court saw fit. It wasn't about who was right or who was wrong. It was about paperwork, numbers, and signatures. I was happy to have kept a significant portion of my finances away so that it wasn't split. And just like that, it was over. I walked out of that courthouse feeling like I had been sleepwalking for years. And even though there was a strange emptiness in knowing that chapter was closed, it was officially over after divorce. I didn't rush into anything. I didn't chase revenge or try to prove anything to anyone. I just focused on myself for the first time in a long while. For years, I'd held off on certain things, not because I couldn't afford them, but because I was always planning with someone else in mind. Marriage makes you think in twos. Every big decision, you weigh it with your partner's wants and needs. But now it was just me, and honestly, I owed myself. I started buying things I'd shelved for years. Even took a trip out of the country just because I felt like it. There was no one to argue with, no one to justify anything to. For the first time in a long time, I felt peace. It was almost a year after everything had been finalized when Andrea reached out. At first, she played it cool like we were old classmates catching up. I could tell she was testing the waters, trying to feel out my mood. I didn't give her much to work with. I had made peace with what happened. That part of my life was closed, and I didn't see the point in dragging up what I'd already buried. But the more I ignored her, the more she started sending more messages. They had a weight to them. She wrote about how she thought freedom would be exciting, how she imagined she'd feel alive, unburdened, finally herself. But that wasn't how things turned out. She admitted without directly saying it that she'd been reckless. She'd been living large, thinking the settlement money would stretch further than it did. She believed her job would be enough to keep up with the life she was trying to maintain. But reality doesn't care about fantasies. The debt stacked up and the interest swallowed her paychecks faster than she could keep up. She never came right out and asked for help. She was careful with her words, but the undertone was clear. She was drowning, and she was hoping I'd throw her a rope. Whether that rope was financial or emotional, I couldn't tell. But I didn't stick around to find out. I cut the conversation short. I told her plainly, I'm not interested in your tales. That wasn't meant to be cruel, but I had nothing left to give her. Not sympathy, not closure, not a dollar. Some people learn too late that not every decision is reversible. And sometimes when you burn a bridge, you don't get to walk back across it later.